When the sun dipped low, somewhere behind a curtain of gray clouds, the ship prepared to leave the harbor. It was not a grand departure. There were no trumpets, no ceremony. Just the quiet, practical movements of tired men, securing ropes, pulling lines, and glancing at the horizon with that familiar look. The look of people who already knew the sea would not be kind tonight. The wood of the ship creaked softly, as if it too were weary of the journey. Each plank carried the memory of other nights, other storms, and other sailors who had leaned against its sides with heavy shoulders and heavier eyes. The smell of tar, damp rope, and salt drifted through the air, the everyday perfume of medieval seafaring life. It was not sweet, but it was familiar enough to be a kind of comfort. The sails were not raised all at once. They went up slowly, as if reluctant, heavy with moisture from the sea air. Cloth that had once been crisp was now softened by years of spray and storms. Sailors pulled at the ropes with steady rhythm, not hurrying, not rushing. There was no point in rushing. The sea moved at its own pace, and men were only ever dragged along behind it. Voices carried softly across the deck, not shouting, just murmurs. One man coughed. Another shifted his boots against the damp planks. A rope slapped lazily against the mast, a sound that would repeat itself through the night until it became part of the silence. The harbor slipped away behind them. A line of faint lanterns flickering like distant stars. And ahead, only water. Endless and dark. The sky and sea blurred into one another so that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. A flat horizon, black against black. A light drizzle began, the kind that seeps quietly into wool without being noticed at first. It touched faces and shoulders, leaving no spot truly dry, but sailors did not flinch. They were used to it. Rain was as constant as the sea itself, and the body learned to accept it. Someone adjusted the tiller, and the ship groaned as it angled into the open water. The movement was not dramatic, just a slow, steady roll that made the lantern at the bow sway in a wide, sleepy arc. Shadows stretched across the deck, moving back and forth with the rhythm of the waves. There was no conversation about storms, no dramatic warning. Only the quiet acknowledgement of what was to come. The men had seen skies like this before. Thick, heavy clouds pressed down so low they seemed to sit on the mast itself. The air smelled of rain and iron, and the sea beneath them shifted restlessly. Waiting dot and so, the night began. A ship, not grand, not new, but reliable, carrying men who were tired, damp, and resigned. There was no sense of adventure in their faces, only endurance. The sea would rise, the storm would come, and they would outlast it, as they always had. Not because they were stronger than the waves, but because they had no other choice. The ship creaked once more, as though sighing, and the last faint light of the harbor faded into nothingness. Ahead lay the long hours, the rolling dark, and the endless, sleepy rhythm of water against wood dot, and as the drizzle thickened into a steady rain. The sailors leaned into the night, knowing it had only just begun. The sea has a way of telling its secrets, though never in words. Long before the first crack of thunder or the rush of a wave, the signs whisper themselves into the air. That night, as the ship moved farther from the faint glow of the coast, the sailors began to notice those whispers. The clouds that had been thick and gray at dusk were now gathering themselves into heavy folds, sagging lower, pressing closer. The air carried a weight to it, as though the atmosphere itself had grown tired and wished to sink down and rest upon their shoulders. No one announced it. No one needed to. These men had seen it before, and in the quiet of their experience, they simply shifted their weight, adjusted a rope, and let their silence acknowledge the truth that a storm was coming. The wind began to change, not with violence, but with a slow, unsettling patience. It no longer moved gently across the surface of the water, but pushed with a new kind of intent, as though testing the sails, teasing the edges of the ship's balance. Every gust had a slightly different tone, a new timbre that hummed against the mast and sighed through the rigging. The ropes themselves began to stiffen and shiver, their fibers stretching and tightening with each pull of the air. Sailors leaned, Into it, boots firm against the wet planks, eyes lifting toward the shadowed sky. They did not call out warnings or give dramatic orders. Instead, there was a kind of mutual understanding that required no words. The sea was shifting its mood, and they must shift with it out above them. The first drops of real rain began to fall, heavier and more deliberate than the light drizzle earlier. The drops did not splash, not really. They seemed to sink directly into the wood, into the cloth of the men's tunics, into the very air, as though the entire world was gradually being soaked. The rain carried with it the faint metallic tang that sailors often associated with storms. A scent like iron mingled with salt, a taste that clung to the tongue. The drizzle grew steadier, a fine mist that seemed to come not only from the sky, but from every direction at once, seeping through seams and cracks, finding its way into every fold of clothing and every crevice of the ship. A man shifted on the deck, brushing the water from his brow, though he knew it was useless. The rain did not relent. It simply became part of them. The sea below responded with its own quiet language. No great waves yet, only a restless rolling. Like a sleeper turning over in their bed, dissatisfied with dreams. The surface swelled and dipped, not harshly but persistently, tilting the ship in long, slow arcs. Each movement pressed the boards of the deck to groan against one another, the sound low and wooden, as if the ship itself was murmuring in its sleep. Barrels shifted faintly in their lashings. Chains clinked with a rhythm that matched the swell of the sea. And through it all, the men moved carefully, one hand always steadying themselves against wood or rope, their bodies learning to sway with the ship instead of against it. The sky itself darkened in a way, that went beyond the absence of sunlight. It was not just night anymore. It was a deep enclosing blackness that carried no star, no moon, no guiding point of light. The clouds had gathered into a seamless ceiling, smothering every glimmer of brightness. It was as though the heavens had drawn a curtain, leaving only the ship, the men, and the endless rolling of the water. A lantern swung lazily near the bow, its flame shrinking and swelling with every gust of damp wind, but even that glow felt swallowed by the night. The light touched nothing beyond a few feet, and beyond that small circle, there was only endless shadow dot in this darkness. The sailors grew quieter still. The ordinary chatter of men at work, the muttered jokes, the passing of idle thoughts, all seemed to fade. Words did not belong in this kind of night. They would only be lost to the wind or drowned in the creaking of the ship. Instead, the men let the sounds of the sea speak for them, the slap of rain against the deck, the low groan of timbers, the restless hiss of the waves. Some shifted their cloaks tighter around their shoulders. Others leaned against the rail and stared out at the horizon they could no longer see. The silence was not fearful. It was simply practical. The kind of silence that came when men had nothing new to say about what they already knew too well. And as the rain thickened and the clouds pressed even lower, the sailors knew the night would not pass quickly. Time itself seemed to slow on nights like these, stretched thin by darkness and repetition. Every minute lingered, every movement dragged into a long echo. Yet they endured it as they always did, not with drama or defiance, but with weary patience. For storms did not come in a sudden rush. They came gradually in layers of wind and water, in shadows that deepened step by step. And so the men prepared themselves, not for survival in the dramatic sense, but for the long drawn-out waiting that survival truly was. The ship did not lurch violently at first. There was no sudden crash of water against its sides, no jarring shift to throw men from their feet. Instead, the rolling came quietly, almost politely, as if the sea were testing its balance before deciding how far it might push. The deck swayed in long, slow arcs, the kind that gave men time to prepare their legs, to plant their boots a little wider, to lean instinctively with the movement. It was not yet chaos, but it was never comfortable. The body was made for solid ground, for soil that did not shift beneath every step. And so even the gentlest rocking reminded each sailor of just how far they were from the land they missed. The boards beneath them seemed alive, rising and sinking like a chest breathing in sleep, sighing and groaning with every swell. The sound was constant, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby, but one that wore thin, with repetition, dragging into the nerves of the men who had no choice but to endure it. With every swell, the lantern swayed wider, throwing shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink like living things. A man standing still would find himself half in light, half in darkness, as the flame shifted its circle across the deck. The ropes overhead groaned softly as the weight of the sails pulled against them, straining with each movement of the mast. That sound, rope tightening, rope loosening, became as steady as breathing, a reminder that the ship itself was, laboring in its own way, fighting against the restless water. The men adjusted to it without thinking, their muscles working without command, knees bending with the roll, spines leaning just enough to keep their balance. But though they adjusted, they never quite forgot the effort of it. To live on a moving deck was to live in a state of constant correction, small and unending, like walking up and down a hill that never stopped shifting beneath you. The rain had grown heavier, and each drop now made itself known against the deck. 1,000 soft caps that blended into a steady hush, almost indistinguishable from the hiss of the sea itself. The wood grew slick, and every step required care. The sailors moved more slowly, testing their weight before they trusted their feet. Boots squeaked faintly, the wet leather softened and swollen from long hours of water. Here and there, small streams of rain found their way between the boards, trickling down into the hold below, where barrels and bundles already sat, dampened from 100 other nights, just like this one. The men did not complain. Complaining would not dry the planks or still the waves. They simply bent themselves into the rhythm of the storm, taking each step with the kind of patience that only years at sea could teach. Above them, the sails shifted. With uneasy sounds, they snapped in the wind and sagged, then swelled again, never entirely still. The cloth, soaked and heavy, caught the gusts imperfectly, dragging at the mast and pulling the ship sideways in ways that kept the helmsman always at work. His hands gripped the great wooden wheel, not with panic, but with steady, endless attention, adjusting left, adjusting right, never quite satisfied, never quite finished. The ship was alive beneath him, resisting his efforts, obeying only in degrees. And so he stood there, shoulders hunched, cloak plastered against his back, steering not toward any destination, but simply away from disaster. That was the truth of sailing in a storm. It was never about the goal ahead, never about reaching port. It was about surviving the moment, about staying upright and afloat long enough for the weather to spend itself. The men on deck felt this. Truth in their bones, they were not afraid. Fear had no place in a night like this. Fear was too sharp, too loud. What they felt was heavier, duller, like the rolling sea itself. A weary resignation, a knowledge that this was the shape of their lives. Some of them leaned against the rail, watching the waves slide by in shadowy curves, black water capped with streaks of dull white foam. Others busied themselves with meaningless tasks, tightening ropes that would soon loosen again, checking knots that had already been checked. These tasks were not urgent, not necessary, but they gave the hand something to do, gave the mind a rhythm to follow as the hours stretched thin. For in the heart of a storm, the greatest challenge was not surviving the water, but surviving the endlessness of it, the dragging hours that offered no end, no comfort, no real change. The sea itself seemed almost indifferent. It rose and fell with the patience of a giant shifting in its sleep, unconcerned with the small figures clinging to their wooden craft. A wave would lift them gently, almost kindly, and then lower them again with the same lack of malice. It was not personal. The sea did not notice them, and perhaps that was what unsettled the men most of all, not the danger of the storm, but the sense of their own insignificance within it. Each drop of rain, each swell of water, each breath of wind was older and more enduring than they were. They were guests, temporary and unwelcome, clinging to planks that would one day rot back into the elements that had birthed them, and yet they did not speak of this. They did not give voice to thoughts so heavy. Instead, they stayed quiet, their silence filled with the sounds of the storm. their minds drifting in the half-dream state that long nights at sea always brought. Some thought of land, though they knew it was far away. Some thought of home, though they knew the memory would bring no warmth. And some thought of nothing at all, letting the roll of the deck and the creak of the mast carry them into a kind of waking sleep, eyes open, bodies swaying, minds half lost in the endless rhythm of water and wood. Time became difficult to measure. Minutes and hours blurred together, marked only by the changing angle of the lantern's swing or the subtle shift in the sound of the rain. The men did not ask how much longer the storm might last. They did not expect an answer. They only endured, one moment flowing into the next. As the ship rolled endlessly beneath them, there are many discomforts in a storm at sea, but none so constant and quietly punishing as the damp that clings to a sailor's clothes. From the moment the first rain began to fall, there was no escaping it. Wool tunics, once rough but warm, grew heavier by the hour, drinking in water as though thirsty for punishment. The fabric sagged against shoulders and arms, wrapping itself tight around the body until every movement carried with it a kind of weary drag. Sleeves stuck to skin, hems clung to legs, and cloaks that had been thrown over for protection became little more than sodden burdens. Dripping steadily with each sway of the deck, the damp did not shock or sting. It crept. It was slow, persistent, a cold that settled into the bones and refused to leave. The men no longer noticed the moment their clothes had become wet. They simply realized hours later that they could not remember what it had felt like to be dry. Boots, too, bore the misery of water. They were thick leather, stitched and bound to withstand the wear of travel and the scrape of planks. But no, stitching was proof against the sea. Rain slid into them with ease, filling each seam and fold, soaking the wool wrappings within. The sailors walked with that particular heaviness of wet boots, each step accompanied by a faint squelch. Each movement slower and more deliberate. Some tried to shake the water free, lifting one foot and then the other, but the relief never lasted. The sea always found its way back in. The boots rubbed against their ankles, softened and swollen, raising blisters that would sting for days. Yet still they wore them, for bare feet on a rolling, rain-slick meant worse danger. Better the ache of wet leather than the slip that could send a man tumbling into the black water below. The dampness was not only in their clothing, it was in the very air. Every breath tasted of salt and wet wood, as though the lungs themselves were lined with seawater. Hair hung in lank strands, dripping into eyes, plastering itself against foreheads and cheeks. Beards grew heavy with moisture, small streams of rainwater running down their edges to vanish into collars already soaked. Nothing remained untouched. A man might shake his cloak, wring out his sleeves, slap the water from his boots, but within minutes the rain returned, patient and endless, undoing every effort. The men did not rage against it. Rage required energy, and energy was not something to waste. Instead, they endured the way they endured everything, silently, with the slow acceptance of those who had long since realized there was no other. Choice at times, the cold would settle in so deeply that shivers began, not sudden, but gradual, creeping up from the spine and out into the limbs. A sailor might pull his arms tighter across his chest, bow his head against the wind, and wait for the shiver to pass. Sometimes it did, sometimes it did not. The body learned to conserve itself, to move just enough to keep the blood flowing, but not enough to exhaust the little warmth that remained. The men would shift from foot to foot, lean against the rail to rest their backs, or huddle briefly near the lantern where its faint flame offered not heat, but at least the illusion of it. The damp wrapped around them like another skin, a constant reminder that comfort was not something the sea had ever promised. The smell of wet wool hung thick in the air, mixed with the sharper scent of salt water and the sourness of damp leather. It was not unbearable, not strong enough to offend, but it was steady, lingering, seeping into nostrils and clinging to the senses. Every man carried it with him, and every man ignored it, for it was as much a part of the sea as the sound of the waves or the groan of the mast. If one were to complain, it would be as pointless as complaining about the rain itself. The sea gave no ear to such things. The damp would remain until the sun returned, and the sun was nowhere to be seen. The sailors moved as though underwater, their clothes dragging, their boots heavy, every task made slower by the weight of water. When they bent to pull at ropes, the sleeves of their tunics clung tight to their arms, resisting each motion. When they leaned down to check a knot or lash a barrel, water dripped steadily from their hair, from their noses, from their chins, spotting the wood below with dark little circles that blended into the rest of the damp. Even rest was no escape. When a man crouched or sat, his cloak pooled around him in a wet heap, soaking him more thoroughly than if he had remained standing. Sleep, when it came at all, came to bodies that were shivering, clothes that were heavy, and boots that never seemed to dry dot, and yet, for all the misery of it, there was a kind of resignation in their endurance. This was not the first night they had spent in wet clothes, and it would not be the last. They knew that once the storm passed, once the sun returned, the damp would fade. The wool would dry stiff and scratchy, and the boots would once again be merely boots instead of small prisons of leather and water. They had lived this cycle before. Wet, dry, wet again, and they would live it again. Complaints would not hasten the sun. Suffering did not shorten the storm. The sea carried on at its own pace, and the men carried on at theirs, bodies growing heavier with water, but spirits left, somehow, just light enough to keep going in the silence of the storm. Their discomfort became almost meditative. Each drop of water, each squelch of a boot, each chill that ran through their skin was part of a rhythm that had no beginning and no end. The men breathed into it, fell into step with it, accepted it as the shape of their world. They did not speak of relief, nor did they dwell on pain. They simply lived moment by moment, soaked to the skin, waiting for nothing, expecting nothing, knowing only that time itself would one day carry them past it. And so they endured, leaning into the night with clothes that weighed them down, boots that slowed their steps, and a patience born only of necessity. Every ship at sea required men to keep watch. And on stormy nights, this task fell into a rhythm as endless as the waves themselves. A sailor would stand near the bow, or sometimes along the rail, eyes straining into the distance where sky and water blended into one indistinguishable blackness. It was not a watch for beauty. There were no stars to count, no moonlight to follow. There was only shadow piled upon shadow, an endless wall of dark, stretching in every direction. And yet, the duty remained. To watch the horizon, even when there was nothing to see, was as necessary as breathing. The men knew that dangers rarely announced themselves. A sudden rock, a drifting piece of wreckage, a shift in the wind, all could rise out of the nothingness with no warning at all. To be alert was to be safe. To be distracted was to risk not only oneself, but the lives of everyone aboard. The man on watch would lean forward slightly, bracing himself against the rail, the rain running steadily down his back, his cloak clinging to him as though it had grown into his skin. His boots squeaked faintly on the wet planks with every small adjustment of his stance. The sea rose and fell beneath him, carrying the ship in its slow rolling embrace, forcing his body to sway in rhythm even when he wished to stand still. He narrowed his eyes against the wind, though it made little difference. Darkness does not yield to effort. He could stare until his vision blurred, until his eyes burned with the strain, and still see nothing but the endless void where water met sky. The horizon was there, but hidden, swallowed, distant in a way that made the world feel both impossibly vast and unbearably close. There was a loneliness in the watch, even when another man stood only a few feet away. To stare into that endless dark was to be reminded of the sea's indifference, of the sheer smallness of a single human body against the measureless weight of water. The silence deepened here, broken only by the occasional slap of a wave against the hull or the groan of the mast as the wind pressed against it. The man on duty might shift, might clear his throat, might murmur a word or two, but no conversation ever truly began. Talking felt out of place, as though the vast silence might take offense at being interrupted. And so the watch became not a task of the eyes, but of the mind, a long, slow meditation filled with thoughts that came unbidden. Sailors often found themselves drifting into memory during these hours. The darkness gave them little else to hold on to, and so their minds returned to places far from the storm. Some thought of fields they had once walked, fields that never shifted beneath their feet, where rain fell straight down instead of slanting sideways on the wind. Others thought of hearths and fires, of the simple warmth of dry clothes and bread that was not salted to last a voyage. Faces rose in the mind's eye, mothers, wives, children, friends long since gone. They were not clear faces, not sharp and vivid, but softened, blurred by distance and time, half forgotten, but never truly lost. The sea had taken them far, but the mind always brought them back. And so the watch became not only a search for dangers in the water, but a journey inward across the darkened map of memory. But not all thoughts were warm. Some sailors remembered debts they could not pay, mistakes they could not undo, losses. That weighed heavier than the sodden wool on their shoulders. The sea had a way of pressing such thoughts forward, for in the dark hours there was little to distract from them. The creak of the ship, the endless hiss of the rain, the rolling blackness of the horizon, all seemed to echo those hidden worries. And still the men stood their post, not resisting the thoughts, not fleeing them, but letting them rise and fall like the waves themselves. For that was what the sea taught best. Endurance, not escape. Occasionally the watcher would shift his gaze downward, toward the water immediately beside the ship. Here, faint patterns of foam glimmered white against the darkness, rolling and dissolving with every swell. Sometimes the sea seemed to glow faintly with this strange greenish light of phosphorescent life. Tiny sparks scattered across the surface, like fallen stars. These lights were not bright, not strong enough to guide, but they were something to hold on to in the vast dark. The sailor would watch them drift, flicker, vanish, and reappear, tracing the ship's slow passage through the storm. They offered no comfort, no safety, but their presence reminded him that life existed even here, in the blackest night. Clinging to the restless surface of the sea, the hours passed without measure. The sailor did not count them, for counting made the time feel longer. Instead, he sank into the rhythm of it, the rise of the ship, the fall, the drip of water from the rail, the faint slap of his cloak in the wind. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, though he saw nothing. His mind wandered, though his body stayed steady. In this way, the watch became not a duty of action, but a duty of presence. To stand, to endure, to wait, that was enough. And in the silence of the deck, surrounded by men who dozed where they could or labored quietly at their tasks, the sailor on watch knew himself to be both utterly alone and utterly bound to the others. His gaze into the darkness was not only for himself, but for them all. His endurance was their endurance. His patience was their safety. It was a heavy burden, but one carried not with pride or complaint, but with the quiet acceptance of a man who knew no other life. The horizon offered nothing in return. It remained hidden, distant, impenetrable. But still he watched, because watching was what kept them alive. And when, at last, another sailor came to relieve him, he did not sigh in relief or stretch with joy. He simply nodded, stepped aside, and let the next man take his place. The sea was endless, the night was long, and the horizon would always need watching. Lantern light was the only fire a ship could safely carry into the storm. And even that glow seemed fragile, a trembling thing that fought for its existence against the weight of wind and rain. Hung from hooks along the deck or lashed carefully to beams, the lanterns swayed with every roll of the ship, their small flames shrinking and flaring, shrinking again, as though struggling to breathe in the dampness. The light they cast was weak, more shadow than brightness, spreading across the wet planks in thin, uneven circles. To walk from one end of the ship to the other was to move from island to island, stepping briefly into the glow before vanishing. Back into darkness, as though the sea itself were swallowing the men whole between flickers of fire. No lantern ever promised safety. It promised only a reminder that light still existed, though it was never enough to banish the night. The smell of tallow filled the air near them, a faint, greasy smoke that clung to nostrils and seemed oddly out of place among the sharper scents of brine and wet wood. Sailors grew so used to it that they no longer noticed, except in the rare moment when the flame sputtered and a curl of darker smoke rose upward, forcing a man to wave it from his face. The sound of the lanterns was almost more noticeable than their sight. Each one hissed faintly, the wick struggling against the constant dampness that crept into everything. Sometimes the flame would shrink nearly to nothing, glowing only as a red ember before a stray breath of wind brought it back to life again. The men learned not to trust them fully. A lantern might burn for hours, or it might die in a moment, leaving only the memory of its glow. Yet still they were tended carefully, even reverently, for without them the ship would vanish into utter blindness. A sailor assigned to check the lanterns did so with the patience of ritual, shielding the flame with his hand, trimming the wick when needed, refilling the oil as though feeding a small and stubborn creature. His fingers were clumsy in the cold and wet, but he worked slowly, knowing haste could snuff the light entirely. Around him, others moved in and out of the glow, their faces appearing briefly, pale and weary, before dissolving again into the black. For a moment, one could imagine the ship as a floating chain of little fires, each one carrying the burden of the men's confidence, each one insisting, however weakly, that night could be resisted. The shadows those lanterns cast were alive. With every sway of the ship, with every gust of wind, the shadows stretched long and then snapped back short, flickered across ropes, danced along the beams of the mast. A man standing still appeared to move in the corner of another's eye, his outline bending and shifting as though the light itself could not decide his shape. Faces looked hollowed, features deepened by the dark lines that cut across them. In some ways, the lanterns made the ship seem less real. It became a shifting place, part wood, part shadow, part reflection of fire. To live by lantern glow was to live in a half-world where nothing appeared quite as it was, and everything seemed ready to vanish as soon as the light gave out. There was comfort in them too, though in their persistence. No matter how strong the rain, no matter how heavy the wind, the lanterns clung on, little stubborn flames that refused to die. Men glanced at them in passing, not to admire them, but to reassure themselves that the ship remained lit, that the night had not yet won. In the dark hours, when time seemed endless and the storm felt as though it had lasted forever, a lantern could become an anchor for the mind. To watch it swing back and forth, was to fall into rhythm with it, to measure time by the slow arc of light across the planks. Some men would fix their gaze on one for minutes at a time, staring into the flame until their thoughts dulled, their weariness folded over them, and they forgot, for a moment, the cold pressing in at their skin. The glow revealed small details that might otherwise have been lost. Drops of rain sliding down a rope, gathering into rivulets that sparkled for just a moment before falling. The sheen of water across the deck, broken by the ripples of a man's bootstep. The grain of the wood, darkened and swollen, each line standing out sharply in the wavering light. Even the simplest things, a coil of rope, a wet cloak, the curve of a barrel seemed strange under lantern glow, transformed by the shifting balance of brightness and shadow. To stare at them too long was to lose sense of what was real, as though the ship itself were not built of solid wood, but of firelight and suggestion. But perhaps the most important task of the lantern was not to reveal, but to remind. To remind the sailors that the world had not vanished, that there was still a deck beneath their feet, still a mast above their heads, still ropes and sails and work to be done. Without the lanterns, the storm might have swallowed everything, left only the roar of wind and the endless black. With them, there was at least a sense of place, however fragile. The men could see just enough to believe in the ship, in their labor, in the small community bound together by dampness and fatigue. The lanterns were not strong, but strength was never the point. They were steady, and in the endless night of the sea steady was enough. Hours passed, and still the lanterns swayed, marking time in arcs of dim fire. Some flickered out and were relit. Some burned lower, their flames no more than trembling pinpricks in the dark. But none were abandoned. Each one was watched, tended, coaxed into survival. For every sailor knew the quiet despair that came when a lantern went out and left nothing but darkness behind. Better to spend precious oil, better to fight the damp and shield the flame with tired hands than to face the sea without a single glow to hold against it. The lanterns might not drive back the storm, but they gave the night a shape. And in that shape, the men could endure. The ropes of a medieval ship were its veins, and in the storm they demanded endless attention. They stretched from mast to sail, from deck to yardarm, thick with salt and swollen with dampness, every strand heavy with the weight of water. To pull at them was not merely a task, but a battle, fought in silence and repeated without pause, again and again through the long night. A man would grasp the rope with both hands, his palms already raw from earlier hours, his fingers stiff and clumsy with cold. The fibers bit into his skin, leaving deep lines that burned each time the rope shifted. He leaned back, easing the weight of his body more than the strength of his arms, hauling against resistance that seemed alive, as though the rope itself resented being moved. For the sails above, soaked through and pressed hard by the wind, resisted every adjustment, pulling back with the stubbornness of a living thing. The labor was not sudden or sharp, but drawn out, a steady tugging that demanded patience more than speed. The sailors bent their knees, braced their boots against the slick planks, and pulled in rhythm, each heave matched by another, the group moving as one. Their breaths came in sharp bursts, misting in the cold air, merging with the spray of rain and sea. Sometimes the rope would give a little, sliding under their hands, only to tighten again as the wind shifted. Progress was measured not in yards or even feet, but in inches. A slow, grinding battle against both weather and wood. And when at last the sail bent to their command, when the ropes were tied off with numb fingers and the work seemed done, the storm would change, the wind twisting again, and the task would begin anew. The ropes themselves told their own story. Worn smooth in some places, frayed in others, they carried the memory of countless voyages. Salt stiffened their fibers, leaving them rough to the touch, and the constant damp made them swell and shrink in cycles that weakened their strength. A sailor knew them as well as he knew his own body, which rope held the mainsail, which tightened the foresail, which needed constant checking for signs of wear. In the storm, though, distinctions blurred. All ropes became equally heavy, equally unyielding, equally ready to snap without warning. The men worked with ears as much, as hands listening for the creak that warned of strain, the sharp twang that signaled a rope about to break. When one did break, it was like the crack of thunder, sudden and violent, whipping through the air with a force that could bruise or kill if it struck a man unawares. And so they handled them with respect, never careless, never quick, always, with the slow steadiness of those who knew the danger hidden in every strand. Their hands told the cost. Palms split open in thin, shallow cuts where fibers scraped the skin raw. Blisters swelled and burst, leaving tender patches that smarted with every touch. Nails broke, dirt and salt pressed into the wounds, and the cold made healing a distant hope. The men did not complain. They wrapped their hands in rags when they could, though the rags grew wet and offered little relief. Some rubbed grease or tallow into their palms, trying to soften the burn, but the storm always wore away such small comforts. Their hands became tools, scarred and worn, shaped by the ropes as surely as the ropes were shaped by them. To pull at the ropes was not just a task of the night, but a mark of their lives, written in calluses and scars that never truly faded. Sound of the work filled the air, blending with the rhythm of the storm. The creak of rope through pulleys, the thud of boots against the deck, the grunts of effort as men leaned back and pulled together, all became part of the ship's endless song. Sometimes the rope would slip suddenly, causing men to stumble, curses lost to the wind as they tightened their grip again. Other times the rope held steady, inch by inch responding to their command, the sail above slowly shifting, its heavy fabric flapping with a noise like thunder before catching the wind once more. These sounds never ceased. They rose and fell, with the storm repeating with every change in the wind, with every adjustment demanded by the restless sea. The work had no beginning, no end, only cycles, endless and wearying, repeating until time itself lost shape. And yet, for all its hardship, the work bound the men together. No rope was ever pulled alone in a storm. One man's strength was nothing against the resistance of soaked sails and raging wind. But 10 men pulling together could move mountains, or at least hold back the sea for another hour. They did not need to speak to find rhythm. Their bodies found it naturally, leaning back in unison, pulling in unison, resting in unison, until they became less a group of individuals than a single, force bound by rope. In those moments, the ship itself seemed to breathe with them, swaying and groaning, but enduring, carried not by wood or canvas, but by the shared labor of tired, soaked men who had learned that survival depended on their unity. The ropes never grew lighter. The sails never grew easier to move. But the men endured, because endurance was all they knew. They'd pulled, tied, checked, and pulled again, their bodies aching, their hands raw, their clothes heavy with water. The work became not a task, but a state of being, something they did without thought, as natural as breathing. And when they finally paused, when the ropes were secure and the sails held steady, they did not celebrate. They only leaned against the rail, catching their breath, waiting for the next shift of wind that would send them back into the labor again, dot above them. The sails strained and flapped, massive sheets of fabric alive with the storm, and the ropes hummed with tension, vibrating faintly under the strain. The ship pressed forward, steady only because of the endless pulling below. The men did not think of the larger picture. They did not imagine where the ship was headed or what lay ahead. They thought only of the next rope, the next knot, the next adjustment demanded by the restless night. And in that narrow focus, they found something close to peace. Not comfort, never ease, but peace. The steady rhythm of work that had no end. The acceptance of a task too large to finish, but small enough to survive, moment by moment. Pull by pull dot to step below deck during a storm was to enter another world, one removed from the roar of wind and the spray of rain, yet in its own way even more oppressive. The moment a sailor ducked through the narrow opening, stooping low so as not to strike his head on the beams, the air changed. It was warmer here, but not with the comfort of a hearth fire. It was the heat of too many bodies pressed into a space. Too small, of damp clothes steaming faintly, of breath collecting in a heavy haze that hung beneath the low ceiling. The storm outside became muffled, its howl replaced by the groaning of wood and the rush of water against the hull. The deck above creaked and shuddered, and every man below could feel the sway in his bones, a slow rocking that never ceased. It was not quiet, never quiet, but the noise here was of confinement, of wood strained to its limits, of men coughing in the dark, of water dripping steadily through seams that no caulking could fully seal. The smell was the first thing that overwhelmed a new arrival. It was not a single scent, but a mixture layered so thickly that the nose could not separate them. Salt, damp wood, and the sour staleness of wet wool dominated, but beneath these lay deeper odors. Sweat that had soaked into clothing and never dried. Unwashed bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Food stores beginning to spoil. Bilge water, sloshing in the lowest part of the ship. Rats contributed their own sharp tang. Their scurrying paws and faint squeaks, a constant reminder that the men shared their quarters with many others who asked for no permission. The air never cleared, for there were no windows, no breeze to sweep it clean, only the occasional draft that carried not relief but more dampness. A man could get used to it in time, but it was never pleasant, never forgotten. The space itself was low and narrow, beams pressing down close overhead so that taller men had to stoop constantly. Hammocks swayed in the dim light, crude lengths of canvas or rope stretched between posts, rocking with the motion of the sea. Not all men had hammocks, and those who did not found what quarters they could. curling on damp boards, resting against barrels, or spreading cloaks over coils of rope. Privacy did not exist. A man slept inches from another, their breaths mingling. Their movements felt through the thin space between them. Every cough, every groan, every restless turn echoed across the confined chamber. The lanterns here gave only the faintest light, enough to cast long shadows against the beams, but never enough to drive away the gloom. Darkness pressed in, and men's faces appeared pale and hollow, their eyes catching the glow before vanishing again into shadow dot below deck. The storm was not seen, but felt. The ship pitched and rolled, the floor shifting beneath every step, the hammocks swinging like pendulums. Water leaked through seams, dripping steadily into buckets or pooling in corners where it spread slowly across the boards. Each creak of timber sounded louder here, as though the ship itself groaned directly into the ears of those trapped inside it. Men who had labored above came down dripping, shedding water as they moved, their cloaks heavy, their boots squelching. The damp spread everywhere, soaking bedding, softening wood, clinging to skin. Nothing dried. Clothes remained wet from the first day of a storm until long after it had passed. And the chill that settled into bones was one that no blanket could chase away. Food below deck was little comfort. Salted meat and hard biscuit were common, both difficult to stomach in the stale, humid air. The biscuits grew soft in the damp, sometimes sprouting mold, sometimes harboring insects that wriggled when broken open. Men ate them anyway, biting through with tired jaws, chewing slowly in silence. Water was drawn from barrels, often tasting of the wood that held it, sometimes tinged with the sharpness of age, sometimes already spoiled. Ale was better, but never plentiful, and it too soured in time. To eat and drink below deck was not an act of pleasure, but of necessity, done quickly, done without talk, done to keep the body moving when the work above demanded it again. Conversation below deck was hushed, not because of fear, but because the space itself pressed voices down. The men spoke in murmurs, leaning close, their words swallowed by the creaking of timbers. Some told small stories, half-remembered tales from childhood, or repeated jokes worn thin from retelling. Others said nothing at all, staring into the dark, their minds wandering elsewhere. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by coughs, by the shuffling of bodies trying to settle in cramped space, by the occasional sharp squeak of a rat disturbed in its search for crumbs. Time moved strangely here. Without sight of the sky, without the measure of stars or sun, hours stretched and blurred. Men lost track of how long they had been awake, how long they had slept, how many nights the storm had lasted. The lanterns gave no measure, for their glow was constant, unchanging. All that mattered was the rhythm of work above, the call to duty, the brief moments of rest below, and then the climb upward again. Despite the hardship, below deck was also a place of endurance. Here men clung to what little comfort they could find. A cloak folded into a pillow, a scrap of parchment kept safe in a pouch, a simple charm carved from wood or bone. These became treasures. The close press of bodies, though stifling, also gave warmth, and in the darkness bonds formed, silent but strong. A man might share a biscuit, or lend a rag to wrap a comrade's bleeding hand, or simply offer a steady presence when the storm grew loud and fear whispered through the beams. The space was harsh, the air foul, but it was also the only refuge the men had. It was the heart of their endurance, the place where they retreated, however briefly, from the endless labor above, dot below. Deck. The storm was never forgotten. It was there in every tilt of the ship, in every drip of water, in every shudder of the timbers. But it was also far away, muffled, as though the sea itself had receded for a while, leaving only its shadow behind. In that shadow, the men lay, still, some awake, some half asleep, all waiting for the call that would send them climbing back into the rain. They did not expect comfort. They did not expect peace. They expected only to endure, and endure they did, in the dim light, in the heavy air and the endless rocking of the ship that never rested dot to a sailor. The storm did not only move the ship and soak the body, it spoke. Its voice was everywhere, surrounding the men above deck and echoing into the chambers below. A voice that could not be silenced or ignored. The wind came first, rising in sudden howls that tore across the rigging, shrieking through the narrow spaces between ropes and beams. It was not a single sound, but 1,000, overlapping, blending, rising, and falling without rhythm. At times it was high and thin, like the scream of something far away and unseen. At other times it dropped into a deep, throbbing moan, the kind of sound that seemed to live inside the very wood of the ship. The men never grew used to it, though they pretended to. Each gust carried its own edge, its own warning, its own reminder that the storm was alive and would not relent. The sea added its own voice, a deeper and heavier one, pounding against the hull with the patience of a drumbeat that never ended. Sometimes the waves struck with sudden violence, slamming into the sides with such force that the entire ship shuddered. Beams groaning, ropes tightening with a sharp twang. Other times the sea rolled beneath them in long, slow heaves, the water rushing against the boards in steady, hissing streams. The sound of water was constant, surrounding the men, pressing into their ears, filling every pause the wind might leave. It was a sound without beginning or end, a sound so endless that the men could no longer tell where one wave stopped and another began. It became a background to their lives, so steady that silence itself became unimaginable. The timbers of the ship joined the storm's chorus, creaking and groaning under the strain. Every board shifted, every beam bent, the sound of stressed wood rising and falling with the waves. To some, it was unnerving, a reminder of how fragile their vessel truly was. To others, it was strangely comforting, for it meant the ship was alive, flexing, adapting, bearing the weight as it had been built to do. The groans and cracks were never silent, even when the men lay below there with their eyes closed, hoping for rest. Each sound came as a reminder that they floated not on certainty, but on 1,000 pieces of wood bound together by rope and hope. Each piece tested in turn by the storm outside Dot, and then there were the sails, flapping and snapping overhead with a noise like thunder, each gust filling them with sudden violence. The canvas beat itself against the ropes with sharp reports that echoed across the deck, startling even men who had heard it 1,000 times before. When the wind caught them just so, the sails roared, a deep and hollow sound, like a great beast drawing breath. At other moments they cracked like whips, sudden and sharp, the kind of sound that cut through even the deepest exhaustion. Sailors knew these sounds well, and they listened to them with ears tuned as much as eyes were to the horizon. A sharp crack might mean a tear, a groan might mean too much strain, and so the men learned to read the storm not only by sight, but by sound. All these voices together created a storm that was never silent, never still. Above deck, the noise battered the ears until men's heads rang, until words shouted into another's ear vanished into the wind, unheard. Below deck, the sounds were muffled, but no less constant. The storm pressed its voice into the beams, into the floor, into the hammocks where the men swayed. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, broken by sudden crashes that shook the hull, by the whistle of a gust forcing its way through cracks, by the endless hiss of water slipping past. Men dreamed in sound, their sleep filled with the endless roar. That had become their world, but for all its noise, the storm's voice was also strangely hypnotic. Once the sailor surrendered to it, once he accepted that silence would not come, the sounds became something else. Not interruptions, but rhythm. The wind howled, the sea pounded, the timbers groaned, the sails snapped, and together they formed a pattern as steady as breath. The men learned to move with it, to rest with it, to labor with it. In time, the storm's voice became not only an enemy, but a companion, speaking to them in tones that were harsh but familiar. It reminded them of where they were, of what they faced, of what they endured. It told them, again and again, that the sea was vast and they were small, but still they endured. still they floated. Still they pressed on through the night. And so the storm spoke, hour after hour without pause. Its voice filled every corner of the ship, from the highest mast to the lowest deck. From the ears of the weary sailor hauling rope to the half-sleep of the man curled in a hammock. It was not a voice that could be answered. It demanded nothing and explained nothing. It simply was vast, unending, indifferent. And the men, for all their labor and fear and endurance, became part of its song. Their breaths and grunts and footsteps blending into the endless voice of wind and water that carried them forward into the night. If the wind was the storm's voice, then the rain was its hand, reaching down from the sky to touch every man and every surface of the ship. It did not fall in drops, neat and measured, but in sheets, wide and heavy, so thick that the air itself seemed to turn into water. At first it stung when it struck the face, sharp and needling, but soon became so constant that the sting was lost in the weight of it, as though the men had walked not into weather, but into the sea itself. Every inch of them grew soaked, hair plastered to their scalps, clothes clinging tight and heavy, boots squelching with each step. The water ran down their foreheads, into their eyes, down their necks, dripping from elbows and fingertips, until there was no separation between man and rain. They carried the storm on their skin, and it carried them in turn. The deck became a river, water flowing in small rushing streams from bow to stern, pouring into cracks, spilling into the bilge. Below, barrels rolled slightly in the rush. Ropes floated for a moment before being dragged underfoot. Boots splashed with every step. Men slipped often, their hands grasping for railings slick with water, their knees bruised from sudden falls. Every surface turned treacherous, every plank a hazard. Work slowed not because the men wanted it to, but because the rain demanded it, pressing against every movement, soaking every grip until fingers lost their hold. The storm's water was everywhere, and everywhere it reminded the sailors that no matter how hard they worked, the ship was never dry, never safe from the sea pressing in. Vision disappeared into the sheets of rain. A man could not see more than a few feet in front of him. The lanterns on deck reduced to weak blurs, their flames hissing under the constant downpour. Shapes blurred, men became shadows, and the masts themselves seemed to vanish into the sky. Above, the horizon, the waves, the stars, all of it was erased, replaced by the unbroken curtain of water. Orders had to be shouted, and even then they were carried off by the storm, leaving men to guess at what had been said, following the movement of their shipmates more than the captain's words. The world shrank until it was only the ship, only the men, only the rain and the sea pressing against them. The sound of the rain was its own endless note, a ceaseless drumming that blended with the roar of wind and the pounding of waves. It struck the sails with a steady hiss, poured against the deck in countless drops, rattled against barrels and helmets, and slid down ropes with a faint whisper. The noise was not sharp, but constant, a background that filled every moment until silence itself seemed forgotten. Men learned to live inside that sound, to labor in it, to rest with it, to hear their own voices swallowed by it. It was as though the storm was not outside the ship, but within it, surrounding and saturating every plank, every rope, every man who stood against it. The rain showed no mercy to the body. Clothes that were already damp became adding weight to every movement, clinging so tightly that men felt as though their very skin had turned to cloth. The cold sank deeper with the water, chilling muscles, stiffening joints, making hands shake as they tied knots or hauled ropes. The water carried salt when the wind drove it from the sea, and fresh when it fell from the sky, but to the men it was the same, endless, cold, and heavy. Their hands wrinkled as though they had been left in water too long, their boots softened, and rubbed raw against their feet, their shoulders bent under the weight of fabric that would never dry. The storm took their warmth, their strength, even their sense of their own bodies, leaving behind only soaked figures moving through soaked air on soaked wood, and yet the men endured it, as they endured everything. They blinked water from their eyes, rubbed it from their brows, spat it from their mouths. They leaned harder on the ropes, braced their feet against the slick planks, shouted when they could, and gestured when they could not. They learned to see through the curtain, to find meaning in blurred shapes, to move by instinct rather than sight. They accepted that they would be wet, accepted that their skin would never dry, accepted that comfort had no place here. Survival meant not fighting the rain, but working through it, letting it soak them, letting it weigh them down, and still pulling, still tying, still enduring hour after endless hour. Below deck, the rain made itself known in other ways. It dripped steadily through cracks, ran in thin lines down beams, pooled on the floor, where men's feet splashed through it. The sound was softer here, more regular, a rhythm of drops that echoed in the gloom. But it was constant, and in its constancy it carried its own weight. Clothes hung up to dry grew wetter still. Bedding grew heavy with damp. Food stores spoiled faster. Barrels swelled and warped. The air grew thick, not only with the closeness of many men, but with the smell of wet wood, wet cloth, and water that never left. Even in their one refuge, the storm followed them, dripping, seeping, pressing its hand against them in silence. The rain had no end. Hours passed, perhaps days, and still it fell, without pause, without mercy. The men lost all sense of when it had begun, or when it might finish. It became not a passing storm, but the very state of the world, as though life had always been this. A ship rocking on endless water, men laboring under endless rain. And though they hated it, though it weighed on them, though it chilled them and blinded them and slowed their every task, still they moved within it. For the storm could drench them, but it could not drown them, not so long as they endured, not so long as they held together against the sea's endless hand. The sea always wanted in. No matter how carefully a ship was built, no matter how tightly the boards were joined or how carefully the seams were caulked, water always found its way through. On calm days it was only a trickle, a slow seep that gathered in corners where men could ignore it for a time. But in a storm, when the ship heaved and groaned and the timbers bent under strain, the leaks grew, water slipped between the boards, ran in thin shining lines down the beams, and fell in a slow but steady rain onto the deck below. It dripped into buckets, pooled in hollows, soaked into cloaks and bedding, spread across the floor in shallow streams that carried dirt, crumbs, and a faint shimmer of oil. It was never still, always moving, as if the ship itself were breathing water in, drop by drop, sigh by sigh, dot at the lowest part of the vessel. The bilge was where all of this water gathered. It was not a place men visited willingly, but a place they had to, for the ship's survival depended on it. The bilge was dark, damp, and foul. It collected not only the seawater that leaked through the hull, but everything else that spilled and dripped and seeped its way downward. Spilled ale, spoiled food, animal waste from goats or chickens carried, a board, and the endless filth that came from 100 men living too close together for too long. All of it mixed into a stagnant pool that sloshed with the rocking of the ship, a liquid as thick with stench as with water. Even the rats avoided it when they could, but sailors had no such choice. Someone had to pump it out. Someone had to keep the ship from drowning slowly in its own seepage, and so men went down into the gloom with buckets, standing knee-deep in the foul water, working by the faint light of lanterns, coughing against the stench that clung to their throats. Pumps themselves were crude, long wooden tubes with handles that men pushed up and down in a rhythm that never ended for long. The water that came out was dark, often carrying with it bits of straw or grease or insects, sometimes even wriggling things best not looked at too closely. The men at the pumps grew weary quickly, for the work was heavy, their arms and backs aching, their lungs filled with the damp air of the bilge. Sweat mixed with the dampness already on their skin, until they felt soaked from within as well as without. The stench lingered on them long after they climbed back up, clinging to their clothes and hair, marking them so that others turned away. It was a task no man wanted, but every man took his turn, for without it the water would rise, inch by inch, until the ship itself grew heavy and sluggish, and the storm, Outside would finish what the leaks had begun. The sound of the bilge was as constant as its smell. The slow drip of water from above, the splash as it struck the foul pool below, the slosh of liquid as the ship rocked, the steady creak and groan of the pumps as men worked them. All of it made a music of decay, a rhythm of endurance. It was not loud, but it was inescapable, echoing through the lower decks like a whisper that never ended. Men who tried to sleep nearby heard it in their dreams. The steady drip, drip, drip of water falling into water, a reminder that the sea was always pressing, always waiting, always ready to claim what belonged to it. The bilge water was not only foul, but dangerous. In its dark depths, unseen things grew. Slime coated the beams, mold spread in patches, insects bred in hidden corners. Men who worked too long in the bilge often came away coughing, their lungs filled with the damp, their skin itching from unseen irritants. Some grew sick, fevers rising as the air thickened in their chests. Still, the work continued, for no sickness could excuse a man from it. The sea did not care for illness, and the ship would not hold itself afloat. So men descended time and again, their boots sinking into the muck, their hands gripping the pump handles, their shoulders straining as they hauled the sea back out the way it had come in. Above deck, the storm raged, but below, in the bilge, there was another kind of storm, slow, quiet, and insistent. It did not roar or howl, but it consumed just the same, wearing men down with its constancy. The storm outside might pass in days, but the bilge never ended. Even when the skies cleared, even when the waves calmed, still the leaks remained. Still. The pumps had to be manned. Still the water gathered in the ship's belly, waiting. A sailor's endurance was not only tested against wind and wave, but against this endless labor, this quiet reminder that a ship was always in danger of drowning from within. And yet, as with all things at sea, the men adapted. They learned to ignore the smell, to work the pumps in rhythm with one another, to empty bucket after bucket without thought. They made small jokes of it, mocking the filth, cursing the sea with weary humor, singing low songs as they worked the handles, the beat of the pumps keeping time. Misery shared became lighter, if only slightly, and the ship stayed afloat, and the voyage continued. For all its foulness, the bilge was part of the life of the sea, as much a part as the stars that guided them or the sails that carried them forward. It was simply another burden, another task, another test of patience and endurance in the long, wet nights that never seemed to end if the wind was the storm's voice, and the rain its hand. Then lightning was its sudden, blinding eye, a gaze so fierce that no man could ignore it. For hours the sailors had labored under darkness, the storm wrapping them in night so thick that only the dim glow of a lantern or the faint memory of stars gave shape to the world around them. Then, without warning, the sky tore open. A bolt split across the heavens, jagged and white, filling the entire sky with brilliance. For a single breath, the sea and ship and men were laid bare, every detail exposed. The ropes glistening with water, the sails thrashing like wings to faces of the men contorted in their effort, and the endless rolling sea stretching into blackness. And then it was gone, replaced once more by the heavy dark. The contrast was so sudden that men blinked hard, their eyes stung as though they had stared directly at the sun. The storm was merciless in this, striking not only with wind and water, but with light itself, tearing vision from them in flashes too quick to follow. Each strike of lightning came with its own shape, its own jagged mark upon the sky. Some were long and branching, like great roots stretching across the heavens, touching sea and cloud in a single line of fire. Others were sharp and direct, spearing downward in a violent rush that seemed to split the very air. They struck without pattern here and there, near and far, each one a reminder of the storm's power. The men could never predict them, never prepare. They lived instead in the anticipation, in the knowledge that at any moment the world might blaze into sudden clarity and vanish just as quickly into darkness again. That anticipation wore on them as much as the storm itself, filling their bodies with tension they could never release. But lightning did not travel alone. Its companion, thunder, followed behind, rolling across the sky with a force that seemed to shake the very bones of the ship. Sometimes it came as a sharp crack, splitting the air so violently that men flinched instinctively, covering their heads as though something had broken overhead. At other times it came as a long, low roll, rumbling through the heavens with a weight that pressed against their chests, vibrating through the planks beneath their feet. The thunder never came at once, always lagging behind, and in that brief pause between flash and sound, men counted, their minds silently measuring the distance between themselves and the storm's heart. The closer the thunder followed, the more tightly they gripped the ropes, the more silent their muttered prayers became. Fear of lightning was different from fear of waves or wind. A wave could be fought with strength, a rope hauled, a sail trimmed, a helm corrected. Wind could be endured, its force met with balance and patience, but lightning was beyond effort, beyond resistance. It struck where it pleased, choosing mast or sail or man without reason. A bolt could splinter wood, tearing a mast into ruin. In a single breath, it could set a sail aflame, fire and water mixing in an unholy dance. It could strike a man directly, ending him in a flash so swift that no one around him could do more than gasp. Every sailor knew such stories, of ships left adrift without their masts, of sails burning in storms, of men reduced to silence in the blink of an eye. And so, though they faced the sea with grit and the wind with labor, they faced lightning. With quiet dread, each flash a reminder that survival was not only skill, but luck. The light itself carried its own cruelty. For those working above deck, their eyes never adjusted fully to night. One moment they strained against the dark, barely able to see the rope and their hands. The next they were blinded by sudden brilliance. Every shadow cut sharp, every detail laid bare. When the darkness rushed back, it seemed deeper than before, as though the night itself had thickened. Men stumbled, blinked, lost their grip, their minds still echoing with the ghost of the light they had seen. Some described it as seeing two worlds at once, the storm as it truly was, and the storm as darkness allowed them to guess at. Neither world lasted long enough to comfort them, leaving them stranded between flashes. And yet, for all its terror, the lightning carried a strange beauty. In those brief instants, the storm revealed itself in full, showing the men not only their ship and each other, but the vastness of the sea that held them. Waves rose like mountains, their peaks foaming white, their troughs black as ink. Clouds swirled above, thick and layered, shifting like living things. Rain glittered in the flash, every drop a silver bead suspended for an instant in the frozen air. Even the faces of the sailors, worn and weary, shone with a kind of stark honesty, lit as though carved in stone. It was a beauty that frightened them, yes, but it was beauty all the same, a reminder that the world was vast, alive and far beyond their control. Below deck, lightning still made its presence known, though the flashes could not reach them directly. The faint glow slipped through cracks and seams, briefly illuminating the gloom. Shadows leapt against the beams. Hammocks flickered with sudden light, and for a heartbeat men saw the dripping wire, the shifting rope, the damp shapes of their shipmates. Then darkness returned, leaving them to wonder if they had truly seen what they thought they had. Thunder followed soon after, shaking the air, rattling the beams, making the very timbers tremble. Even those resting felt it, the storm insisting on its presence, reminding them that even in hiding, even in sleep, they were never beyond its reach. So the night stretched on, punctuated by light and sound, by fear and awe. The storm spoke in voices of water and wood that now it added the fire of the heavens. And the men endured, blinking against brilliance, bracing against thunder, whispering prayers against the strike that might come at any moment. They labored. They waited. They endured, for there was nothing else to do. The sea was never still in a storm, but There were moments when it seemed to rise beyond itself, as though the ocean had remembered it was deeper and older than anything that floated. Upon it, the waves grew, swelling higher and higher, until they no longer seemed like mere water, but like great living walls that moved with purpose. The ship was no longer riding the surface of the sea, but climbing slopes of water and sliding down again, caught between peaks and valleys that shifted and changed with every moment. To look at them too long was to feel the heart falter, for they seemed not only tall, but endless, stretching from horizon to horizon, one after another, a procession of mountains made not of stone, but of shifting, living sea. When a wave lifted the ship, the climb was slow but relentless. The bow rose first, tilting upward, the deck slanting so sharply that men had to clutch the nearest rope or rail just to keep their footing. Barrels rolled toward the stern, water sluiced in streams along the planks, and men staggered as though the ship itself were trying to throw them off. At the crest, the world opened wide. For a heartbeat, the ship seemed to hang above the sea, perched on the edge of a height so great that all around them the water fell away into blackness. The men could see further than at any other time, the endless line of waves rolling toward them, the storm clouds heavy above, the rain streaking sideways in sheets. And then, just as quickly, the ship tipped downward, the bow plunging as, though into a pit, the stern lifting high behind. The fall was not gentle but sudden, stomachs lurching, knees buckling, men crying out as the ship rushed down the slope of water, faster and faster, until it struck the trough below with a crash. So violent it seemed the wood must break apart. Spray exploded upward, drenching every man, flooding across the deck in torrents, sweeping loose ropes and buckets against ankles and knees. Then the next wave came and the climb began again. The sound of the waves was different from wind or rain. It was a deep, booming force, a roar that came not from above, but below, echoing through the very body of the ship. When a wave struck, the timbers groaned, the planks shuddered, the nails creaked in their seams. The whole vessel seemed to cry out, a wooden body enduring punishment from a sea that gave no rest. Men who stood on deck felt it in their legs, in their chests, in their teeth, the entire ship trembling as though alive, straining, resisting, but never fully safe. It was not only heard but felt, every crash of water a reminder that the ocean was heavier, stronger, older than any man. Or any ship, fear of the waves was unlike fear of lightning. Lightning was sudden, violent, unpredictable. A wave, though, could be seen approaching, its shape growing larger, its peak curling, its wall of water dark against the dim light of the storm. That visibility carried its own cruelty. Men had to watch as the next mountain came toward them, watch as it grew larger, watch as it lifted them into the sky or threatened to crash down upon them. They braced themselves for each climb, each fall, each strike, knowing it was coming, knowing there was no escaping it. That waiting, that helpless anticipation, was its own kind of torment, stretching the storm into endless minutes that seemed to last forever. Below deck the waves were no less present. Each rise and fall of the ship was magnified in the close, dark space, hammocks swinging wildly, lanterns swaying, men thrown against one another in the narrow space. The groaning of timbers was louder here, the water sloshing in the bilge more violent. The air filled with the combined sound of sea and ship and men trying to steady themselves against motion that never ceased. Some lay flat, clinging to their hammocks, their stomachs twisting, their heads spinning, every rise and fall a wave in their own bodies. Others tried to sleep, though sleep came in brief snatches, broken by sudden jolts when the ship struck. The trough too hard. Even in darkness, even in the supposed shelter below, the waves owned them. The danger was not only the rise and fall, but the breaking of the waves themselves. Sometimes at the crest, the water curled over, collapsing with a force that could sweep a man from the deck as though he were no heavier than a child's toy. Sailors chained themselves with ropes to the rails, not out of comfort, but out of necessity. For one misstep, one slip on the soaked planks, and the sea would take them. And if the sea took them in a storm like this, there was no rescue. No rope. Thrown in time, no hand reaching into the darkness. The man was gone, swallowed instantly, his cries lost in the roar of water. Every sailor knew it, every sailor feared it, every sailor looked out of the corner of his eye. To be sure his shipmates were still there after each wave passed, the height of the waves distorted even time. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. A man could not measure progress by distance, for the ship went forward only as much as it went up and down, caught in the cycle of rise and fall. The storm gave no horizon to measure against, only wave after wave after wave. An endless succession that blurred together until it seemed as though the ship had always been climbing and falling and always would. There was no destination, no. Sure, only survival from one crest to the next. And yet, in the same way that sailors found a grim beauty in lightning, they found a strange awe in the waves. To stand on the crest and look down into the trough was to see the sea in its full vastness, to understand just how small the ship was, how small the men were, and how immense the ocean could become. The water glistened with the faint light of the storm, each swell a shifting wall of black and silver, alive and restless. In those moments, men did not only fear the sea. They respected it, bowed to it, accepted that it was older and greater than anything they could build. The fear never left them, but it mixed with wonder, leaving them quiet, thoughtful, humbled even in the storm's cruelty dot. So the night passed. Wave after wave, climb after climb, fall after fall. The ship endured, the men endured, though none could say how. They held ropes until their hands blistered, braced their legs until their muscles trembled, prayed until their voices were hoarse. They did not master the storm. They did not fight the waves. They only survived them, one by one, until survival itself became the only measure of time. And still the sea rose, and still the waves came, and still the men endured. The mast was the heart of the ship, tall and central, the spine that bore the sails, the steadying post that gave the vessel its shape and its power. Without it, a ship was not truly a ship, but a drifting shell, helpless against the endless water. Every sailor knew this, and every sailor, when the storm grew too fierce, found himself glancing upward, staring through rain and darkness at the mast, wondering if it would hold. In calmer weather, the mast seemed eternal, rooted into the very body of the vessel, an unshakable pillar of wood. But in a storm, even the strongest mast groaned. The ropes that lashed it pulled and strained with each gust. The sails dragged at it. The ship itself tossed it back and forth. It quivered under the weight. It bent against the wind, and the men below felt that bend as though it were their own. Bones straining. They knew that if it failed, it would fail suddenly, with a crack that no sailor could forget. The sound of a mast under stress was not loud, but it was deep, almost hidden beneath the roar of the storm. It was a low groan, wood grinding against wood, fibers stretching, bolts loosening in their sockets. Men who spent long enough at sea could hear it beneath the other sounds, feel it in the soles of their feet and the palms of their hands when they clutched the wet rails. It was the sound of wood on the edge of breaking, a whisper of warning that the storm might win. And yet, there was no way to stop it. Men could adjust sails, hauling them tighter, reefing them smaller. But the mast still bore the strain. They could pray, but the mast listened only to wind and wave. So they worked on, pretending not to hear it, focusing instead on the endless tasks of survival. Though each man carried in his chest the knowledge that at any moment the heart of the ship might split. When it happened, it was always sudden. A gust stronger than the rest, a wave striking the ship at the wrong angle, a rope snapping with a whip-like crack, and then the mast gave way. The sound was like thunder, a sharp, splintering crack that echoed through the storm, louder than wine, louder than wave. Men shouted, stumbled, clutched at anything near them, for the fall of the mast was not slow, but violent, dragging ropes, sails, and rigging with it. Sometimes it broke halfway, leaving a jagged stump where it had stood. Other times it fell entire, crashing across the deck, crushing barrels, tearing through planks, sweeping men aside with ropes that snapped and lashed like whips. It was chaos, sudden and brutal. The storm outside met by destruction within. The danger of a broken mast did not end with its fall. The wreckage it left behind was as deadly as the storm itself. Sails still tied to the mast billowed in the wind, dragging the ship sideways, threatening to capsize it. Ropes tangled, catching men by the legs, pulling them down, sometimes overboard. Splinters the size of daggers jutted from the broken wood, sharp and ready to wound any who stumbled too close. And all the while, the storm pressed on, giving no time for mourning, no pause for breath. The men had to move instantly, their fear pushed aside by the urgency of survival. Axes were brought out not for enemies, but for their own ship, to cut away the wreckage before it dragged them all beneath the waves. There was no order in those moments, only desperate labor. Men hacked at ropes, their hands slipping on the wet fibers, their arms aching as they swung against wood that resisted them. Others hauled at lines, trying to free sails before the wind could pull them into the sea. Lanterns fell and smashed, their light vanishing, leaving men to work in near darkness, guided by the flashes of lightning that lit chaos in brief, blinding moments. Each strike revealed faces drawn tight with fear, arms straining, bodies slick with rain and sweat. Then the light vanished, leaving them to labor blind once more. The broken mast did not simply fall. It tore the ship into confusion, turning every man's task into a fight against disaster. Below deck, the sound of the mast breaking was no less terrifying. The crack thundered through the timbers, followed by shouts, crashes, the pounding of feet. Men leapt from hammocks, water sloshing beneath them, the whole vessel shuddering as though its very bones had broken. They did not always know what had happened at once, but they knew it was bad, worse than mere wave or wind. They felt the tilt of the ship change, the rhythm of its movement shifting, the balance faltering. Some rushed upward to help. Others stayed below, clinging to beams, whispering prayers, waiting for word of what had been lost. In storms like these, even rumors spread quickly. The mast is gone, the sails are gone, the ship will not last. And though they had no proof, the sound of the storm seemed to agree. The loss of a mast was not only physical, but emotional. Sailors trusted their ship more than they trusted the sea, and when the mast fell, that trust cracked with it. Men looked at one another differently, eyes wide, voices hushed, each wondering if this was the end. Some grew frantic, their work desperate, hands trembling as they hauled ropes. Others grew quiet, withdrawn, their faces set as though already preparing for death. Leadership mattered then more than at any other time. A calm voice, a steady order, could keep panic at bay, could remind men that survival was still possible. But without such steadiness, chaos spread. And chaos was as deadly as the storm dot, and yet, as with all storms, survival depended on endurance. The mast might be gone, the sails torn, but the ship could still float if the wreckage was cut free. If the men held together, if the sea chose to spare them, so they worked on, axes striking, rope severed, sails loosed into the sea. Bit by bit, the danger was lessened, though never gone. The ship was slower now, clumsier, more vulnerable, but it still lived, and so did the men aboard it. That was enough for the moment when at last the broken mast was gone. Cast into the sea or cut down to a stump, the men stood on the deck and looked upward into the storm. The sky was dark, the rain unending, the wind still howling, but the mast was gone, and in its absence they felt both grief and relief. Grief for the ship, wounded and diminished. Relief that the mast's fall was behind them, that the worst of the terror had passed. They stood a little longer, breathing hard, rain washing down their faces, before turning back to their endless labor. For the storm was not done, and neither were they doubt the end of a storm at sea never arrived all at once. It did not end with a clean break, a sudden hush, or a final crash of thunder. Instead, it ebbed in stages, as though the sea itself were reluctant to let go of its rage. The waves, which had once risen like mountains, began to soften, their peaks a little lower, their falls a little less violent. But the ship still rose and fell endlessly, and the men could not yet tell if the danger had passed. The wind still howled through the rigging, tearing at the few scraps of canvas left. Though its pitch was lower now, its force less absolute. And the rain, though still pouring, began to come in steadier lines, falling straight down rather than lashing sideways. It was change, yes, but not yet peace. For sailors, it was a time of uneasy waiting, a time when bodies ached for rest, but nerves refused to relax. Fearing the sea might rise again without warning, the men who had spent hours clutching ropes and hacking away at the broken mast now stood where they could, swaying with the motion of the ship, their arms heavy, their breath shallow. Their clothes were soaked through to the skin, wool clinging to their bodies, salt crusting in their hair and beards. Blisters had formed on their palms where ropes had burned, and their muscles ached as though every sinew had been wrung out. Yet they did not sit. They did not lie down. They kept moving, slowly, mechanically, checking lines, securing what little remained of the rigging, tending to the wounded timbers of the ship. Work became slower now, not frantic, but dragging, each motion taking longer, each step heavier, as though the weight of the storm still pressed down on them even as it began to pass. The ship itself bore the scars of the night. Planks had split, seams leaked water that had to be bailed constantly, and loose debris littered the deck. Ropes, broken barrels, splintered wood from the fallen mast. The ship had survived, but it looked as tired as the men who served it. Its creaks were deeper now, more weary, as though the wood itself had been stretched too far and longed for rest. Yet it still floated, and in that floating there was hope. Even a damaged ship could live to see calm seas again, and so long as the vessel stayed afloat, so too did the sailor's will to endure. Below deck, the atmosphere was different, but no less heavy. The men there had endured the storm in darkness, clutching beams or lying in hammocks that swung like pendulums, each crash of the waves throwing them against wood or one another. Now, as the storm receded, the air was thick with damp and sweat, mixed with the sour stench of sickness for those who had not been able to stomach the endless rise and fall. Lanterns flickered weakly, their oil running low, casting shadows that wavered with the still, unsettled motion of the ship. Here, too, exhaustion was heavy, but the men spoke in low voices, murmuring about the sound of the mast breaking, about the hours of chaos above, about whether the storm was truly ending or only pausing before rising again. No one dared speak. With certainty, for at sea, certainty was always a luxury. As the hours passed, the signs of change became clearer. The thunder, which had cracked so violently overhead, grew fainter, rolling away into the distance. The lightning no longer split the sky in violent flashes, but came only in brief, pale flickers far on the horizon, like the last embers of a fire. The wind, though still steady, began to lose its sharp edge, and the rain softened into drizzle, then mist, a fine veil that clung to skin but no longer stung. Sailors noticed these changes not with joy but with suspicion, their eyes narrowing as they tested the air, sniffed at the salt, and stared at the line of the horizon. For many, storms had faded only to return with double force, and until the sea lay flat and the sky opened, they refused to believe the danger had truly passed. The body often betrayed the mind in these hours. Muscles, kept tense for so long, began to release, and with release came trembling. Hands shook when they tried to tie knots, knees buckled when the deck tilted, and men found themselves dropping tools they had used for years. Exhaustion had been pushed aside during the storm by fear and urgency, but once the worst had passed, it returned all at once, falling on them heavier than any wave. Some men sank where they stood, leaning against barrels or the sides of the ship, eyes half shut, unable to force themselves further. Others stumbled below, collapsing into hammocks without bothering to remove wet clothes or boots. Sleep came quickly, but it was not restful. It was heavy, dreamless, the kind of sleep born not of peace but of survival, where the body shut down. Because it could do no more. For those who stayed awake, the sea at dawn after a storm carried its own kind of strangeness. The horizon, which had been swallowed by black clouds, slowly revealed itself again, a pale line where sky met water. The clouds lifted little by little, their bellies still dark but edged with faint light, as though the world itself were exhaling after a long struggle. The waves, though still tall, began to move with more rhythm, their chaos smoothing into swells that could be predicted, endured, ridden with less terror. The air tasted cleaner, washed by rain, and though the ship was scarred and weary, it moved with more steadiness now, less like a toy caught in a giant's hand, more like a vessel finding its course again. Sailors watched these changes with hollow eyes, too tired to celebrate but quietly relieved. There were no cheers, no shouts of victory. There was only silence, the kind of silence that followed hardship too great for words. The fading of a storm left more than physical wreckage. It left silence heavy enough to feel unnatural, as though the world itself had gone too quiet after. So much noise. Men who had shouted to be heard over the roar of wind now spoke barely above whispers, as though afraid to break the fragile stillness. Every creak of the ship, every splash of water against the hull, every cough from a sailor seemed too loud. The ears, attuned for hours to thunder and crashing waves, now strained against the absence, searching for sounds that no longer came. And in that silence, the memories of the storm settled in. The sight of the mast falling, the feeling of the ship plunging down a wave, the cries of men swallowed by the sea. Survival did not erase those memories. It etched them deeper. Each man carried them quietly, folded into the silence like hidden scars. And so the storm ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion, not with shouts of relief, but with the slow, heavy movements of men who had given all they could give. The sea rolled on, calmer now, though still restless, and the ship, battered but alive, drifted forward. The storm had not destroyed them, but neither had it spared them easily. It had left them scarred, weary, changed, yet they endured as sailors always did because the sea demanded it. And in their endurance, they found the only victory the ocean ever allowed: survival. The hours after a storm were not filled with triumph, but with the heavy weight of survival. There were no celebrations, no songs, no laughter. Instead, the men moved as though their bodies had been hollowed out. Their steps slow, their voices low, their eyes ringed with shadows. The storm had taken everything from them but their lives, and it was those lives they now had to carry forward, exhausted and trembling. The deck of the ship, littered with wreckage, was proof of what they had endured. Splintered wood, shredded rope, barrels broken open, water pooling in dark corners. The mast was gone, reduced to jagged remains, and the ship itself leaned differently now. Its balance shifted, its strength diminished. Yet it floated, and that simple fact was enough to keep the men moving. At sea, survival was the only victory, and after such nights, survival alone was more than most had dared hope for. The first task after the storm was always repair, no matter how weary the sailors were. A ship at sea could not be left wounded, for the ocean never allowed long rest. So men brought out tools with trembling hands, hammers, axes, coils of spare rope, and began the slow work of setting things right. Holes in the deck had too. Be patched, leaks caulked, broken beams shored up with what scraps of wood remained. It was work done not with energy, but with grim determination, each man dragging himself through motions his muscles resisted. Nails were hammered in with uneven blows, planks fitted together with sighs of frustration when they did not align. But still the work went on, because it had to. A ship was both home and lifeline, and if it failed, the sea would take them all. So the repairs continued slow and uneven, until the vessel was once again something that could carry them onward. Alongside the ship's wounds, the men tended to their own. Salt water had rubbed their skin raw. Ropes had burned deep grooves. into their palms, and many bore cuts and bruises from flying debris or sudden falls. There was no doctor, only sailors with scraps of cloth and buckets of brine to clean wounds, wrapping hands in strips torn from old shirts, binding ankles twisted on the slick deck. Some injuries were minor, treated with muttered curses and grimaces. Others were worse, leaving men pale and weak, lying in corners while their shipmates tried to keep them alive with water and scraps of hard bread. And then there were those who had not survived the storm at all. Their absence was felt more than spoken, their names unmentioned, but their places empty in the line of workers, their hammocks hanging unused. In quieter moments, eyes glanced toward those hammocks, but no words were said. The sea had taken them, as it always did, and those who remained could only endure. Food after a storm was meager, but it was essential. Men dragged out barrels that had survived the chaos, prying them open with knives and hoping for something unspoiled. Salted fish, damp bread, ale that had grown thin with seawater. These were shared in silence, each man chewing slowly, the act of eating more about survival than satisfaction. The taste was poor, the portions small, but to men who had worked through the night without rest, it was enough. Some ate sitting on the deck among broken planks, others leaning against the rails, their eyes on the horizon. The simple act of filling the stomach was grounding, reminding them that though the sea had raged, life continued. And after eating, many fell into sleep again, their bodies demanding rest more than food. The silence after a storm was one of the strangest things. At sea, the ocean, which had roared and thundered for hours, now moved with quiet heaviness. The waves rolling but not crashing, the wind blowing but not screaming. The ship creaked more clearly now, its tired wood speaking into the calm, and the small noises of men working or breathing seemed magnified. Some sailors found comfort in this quiet, letting it lull them into rest. Others found it unsettling, too empty after the violence, as though the sea were holding its breath, waiting for another chance to strike. But whether comforting or uneasy, the silence was inescapable, stretching across the hours, wrapping the ship in a kind of muffled stillness that pressed on the ears. For many, the hardest part came not during the storm, but after, when the mind finally had time to wander. During the chaos, there was no room for thought, only action, only the desperate work of survival. But afterward, when hands slowed and the sea calmed, memories returned. Each man replayed the night in his own mind, the crack of the mast, the wave that nearly swept him away, the rope that cut into his skin. Some thought of the faces of shipmates lost, imagining their final moments in the black water. Others thought of home, wondering if they would ever see it again, or if another storm might come before they reached safe harbor. These thoughts came quietly, in the stillness, and no one spoke them aloud. But they weighed heavily, settling, in the silence like invisible cargo dot as the day stretched on. The sun broke through the thinning clouds, pale and weak, but still a reminder that the storm was truly over. Its light reflected on the wet deck, glimmering in puddles and warming salt-streaked skin. Men turned their faces upward, not smiling, but simply receiving the warmth, letting it dry their soaked clothes and stiff muscles. The sea itself glittered, in that light still restless but calmer, the horizon sharp and clear. For the first time in many hours, the world looked wide again, no longer swallowed by cloud and darkness. The storm was behind them now, though its memory lingered in every sore muscle, every broken plank, every absent face. And so the ship continued, scarred but afloat, its crew weary but alive. The storm had not been the first they endured, nor would it be the last. This was the life of sailors, a life bound to the sea's endless moods, calm one day, fury the next, silence after chaos. They did not speak of heroism, for they felt none. They did not call themselves brave, for bravery was only another word for survival. They simply carried on, repairing, eating, sleeping, watching the horizon. The sea gave nothing freely, and in return the men asked for nothing but another day of endurance. And in that they found their strange, quiet victory, and with that, The storm is gone, and we leave the sailors drifting forward into calmer waters, tired but alive, as the sea returns once again to its endless rhythm, patient, vast, and waiting,